In the early years of the regime, party leaders projected an image of unity and strength externally, while increasingly marked tensions developed within the movement. The brown shirts, which had played a key role in the rise to power, began to represent an obstacle for those seeking to consolidate absolute control from the top. Among the chiefs of that body, one figure gained notoriety in the capital, a man who combined political ambition with a private life that circulated among Berlin's most well-known nightlife scenes. His influence grew rapidly, at the same time that rumors about his lifestyle fueled discontent among the party's most rigid sectors. The moment the leadership decided to carry out an internal purge, his fate was sealed. How does a loyal collaborator become the target of a silent and definitive elimination? During the early years of the National Socialist movement, the shock units known as brown shirts established their strength through systematic confrontations with political opponents in the streets of cities like Berlin, Munich, or Hamburg. The SA were organized with a mix of military discipline, tactical improvisation, and constant physical presence. Violence became a tool of direct action, used both to intimidate and to gain visibility. In that environment, Karl Ernst appeared, a figure who embodied the group's contradictions: organizational strength, rapid ascent, and a personal life outside the margins established by the regime's official morality. Before joining the party's paramilitary apparatus, Karl Ernst worked as a doorman in several Berlin clubs frequented by men who were part of the city's homosexual scene. These venues not only served as spaces for socialization, but also as points of contact between different social strata. Artists, businessmen, police officers, and men connected to political power regularly visited these clubs. In that environment, Ernst acquired useful skills for access control, dealing with public figures, and managing tense situations. His physical presence commanded respect, and his reserved character allowed him to move effectively without causing scandals. Karl Ernst's entry into the SA occurred at a stage when the party sought to expand its operational base in key urban areas. Berlin, due to its size and political density, became a central objective. Ernst began as part of groups responsible for coordinating marches, controlling strategic corners, and evicting meetings of political adversaries. As he demonstrated initiative and capacity to lead actions, he gained space within the structure. Knowing the codes of Berlin's nightlife, its informal networks, and its protection mechanisms gave him an advantage over other members who came from rural or military backgrounds. In a short time, he was assigned broader responsibilities, and he began to coordinate entire sections of the SA in troubled districts. His experience with crowds, his efficiency in executing orders, and his ability to impose authority placed him in a leadership position. His ascent was rapid and visible, but it was not exempt from comments within the party. Although no one made formal accusations, some cadres pointed to his past as a contradiction with the values the regime intended to promote. The hierarchy ignored these rumors, as long as Ernst remained useful in the operational field. Street politics became a key element for strengthening the party. The SA developed synchronized actions aimed at occupying public spaces, altering daily life, and provoking responses from their adversaries. Under Karl Ernst's command, the Berlin groups perfected this method. Lightning parades, temporary blockades, and symbolic occupation of squares formed part of a constant pressure strategy. Each demonstration had a double purpose: to mark territory and project strength. Police authorities, often overwhelmed, tolerated these actions as long as they did not get out of hand. Institutional ambiguity allowed leaders like Ernst to act with broad discretion. Over time, Karl Ernst became one of the most recognized faces within the SA's urban structure. His name appeared in intelligence reports, press notes, and internal party documents. The management of his troops, his ability to organize events, and his loyalty to the chain of command ensured him a solid reputation. The loyalty he demonstrated towards Ernst Röhm, Supreme Chief of the SA, also strengthened his position. The relationship between the two was built on a tacit understanding. Röhm led a faction within the movement that advocated for a profound transformation of the system, with proposals implying a restructuring of economic and military power. His internal enemies, especially Himmler and Göring, feared that this project would destabilize central authority and undermine the control they aimed to consolidate. The figure of Karl Ernst, by representing a disciplined yet independent version of that model, became uncomfortable for those promoting a more orthodox and vertical line. Conflicts between different party factions sharpened over time. The SS, under Himmler's direction, began to openly dispute the SA's role as the party's main force. The competition shifted to the realm of information, where every movement, every meeting, and every conversation was recorded, interpreted, and archived. Karl Ernst's life entered that surveillance circuit. His routines, meetings, and associations were documented. The surveillance was not immediate, but it grew over time. The SS drafted profiles detailing his surroundings, preferences, and visits to certain venues. In parallel, Karl Ernst's public position remained strong. He coordinated celebrations, led patrols during times of political tension, and received recognition for his work. In the eyes of many sympathizers, he represented the figure of the militant who advanced on his own merits. His organizational capacity, discipline, and closeness to the base gave him legitimacy. However, signs of isolation began to appear. Some invitations were delayed, certain accesses were limited, and messages between him and Röhm no longer flowed with the same frequency. The sectors that previously sought his support now avoided him out of prudence. The preparation for an internal purge began to take shape. In reserved circles, there was talk of the need to clean up the party's structures to strengthen its institutional image. The files prepared by the SS incorporated testimonies, photographs, and records that fed this narrative. The figure of Karl Ernst, who had grown under the logic of direct action, faced a bureaucratic machine willing to reduce him to a functional caricature for the regime's new discourse. Despite the signs, Ernst continued to perform his duties without changing his behavior. He attended meetings, gave instructions to his subordinates, and organized public events. His attitude conveyed confidence, although some close sources detected a certain nervousness. Information flowed slowly, and important decisions were communicated through indirect channels. Warnings about possible changes in the SA's leadership arrived fragmented. Some allies began to distance themselves, while others adopted a stance of silence in the face of what was coming. The signs accumulated without breaking the routine. The city continued to be patrolled by his units, orders were executed, and parades were carried out with precision. But the political environment had changed. Decisions were made beyond his reach. Rumors were no longer denied, and the spaces he once controlled were now occupied by men who answered to other chains of command. The figure of Karl Ernst, who for years had symbolized the power of the SA in Berlin, was exposed to a process that was secretly brewing and executed without room for response. Ernst Röhm became one of the most influential figures in the National Socialist apparatus in the years leading up to 1934. His authority over the SA was almost absolute, and his form of leadership was not only based on the military structure inherited from the First World War, but also on personal loyalties built over time. Röhm used a network of trust composed of close men who shared common experiences, radical ideas about the transformation of the state, and in many cases personal ties that deviated from the public image of the party. Within that network were several men who maintained romantic or sexual relationships among themselves. Party internal reports documented encounters, conversations, and movements indicating the existence of a circle of high-ranking commanders whose effective orientation was known to those around them. Karl Ernst was part of that environment, although his public conduct remained within the margins required by the hierarchy. Röhm defended the autonomy of his armed body and protected those he considered loyal, regardless of the comments circulating outside his circle. The SA reached a considerable size, with more than 3 million members at the beginning of 1934. This double standard became a useful tool for those seeking to weaken Röhm's power. Personal relationships, far from being a private matter, transformed into political material. They were documented, interpreted, and stored with the intention of being used at the opportune moment. Karl Ernst benefited from that informal power structure. His ties with Röhm allowed him to access strategic decisions, organize events with institutional backing, and operate autonomously in front of other party hierarchies. In that group, loyalty was measured by both discipline and discretion. Mutual knowledge functioned as protection, but also as a risk if the balance broke. Ernst's presence at public events, his participation in parades, and his role as organizer of mass events in Berlin made him a visible figure. His authority was not based on formal positions, but on a combination of physical presence, operational capacity, and backing from the high echelons. That direct relationship worried sectors that distrusted the growing power of the SA. Himmler and Goering, among others, viewed with suspicion the autonomy of Röhm and his protégé. They saw in them an obstacle to consolidating a centralized state apparatus under the exclusive command of the leader. As the party advanced in taking control of institutions, the existence of parallel bodies like the SA became problematic. The SS, under Himmler, consolidated as an alternative force, smaller but with a more rigid structure. While the SA operated as an expansive mass of street pressure, the SS emerged as a select guard. The dispute between both was not only functional but ideological. Röhm defended a social revolution within the regime, proposed the replacement of the regular army with his troops, and suggested reforms affecting conservative sectors. That proposal displeased those who had already allied with the army, industry, and state bureaucracy. Rumors about Röhm's personal life and his circle were strongly reactivated. Press articles, internal memoranda, and confidential conversations collected details about hotel encounters, compromising photographs, and testimonies from former comrades. Although part of that information had been known for years, its coordinated dissemination aimed to prepare a strategic turn. Karl Ernst appeared in several of those documents as part of the inner circle of the head of the SA. The conduct of Röhm and his group was presented as a moral, political, and military threat. A narrative was constructed where homosexuality ceased to be a personal matter to become a symbol of decadence, disorder, and corruption. That narrative responded to a political need to justify an internal purge. Karl Ernst, like other members of Röhm's circle, became a target of that strategy. Although his performance as leader of the SA of Berlin remained effective, his closeness to the Supreme Chief and his documented history placed him on a precisely elaborated list. The documents being prepared included detailed biographies, personal relationships, maps of influence, and displacement routes. Each piece of data served to justify a decision already made. The construction of that list implied joint work between the SS, the Ministry of the Interior, and sectors of the army. The accusations presented against the leaders of the SA were not limited to their sexual orientation. They were attributed coup plans, disloyalty to the party, and conspiracies against the state. In that context, the personal ties that previously guaranteed protection became evidence. Photographs, letters, and confidential reports that previously circulated in secret were now used to legitimize arrests and executions. The figure of Karl Ernst appeared in these reports as an example of how poorly managed power can lead to unacceptable deviations. While the operation that would lead to the purge was being prepared, those involved received no direct signals. They continued with their functions, organized events, presided over meetings, and issued orders. Karl Ernst did not interrupt his activity or modify his routines. His conviction that Röhm's backing and his trajectory protected him remained until the days before his arrest. The signs of distancing that had manifested months before were confirmed only when it was too late. Orders came from above and were executed without margin for objection. The construction of the official narrative after the coup included the explicit condemnation of the sexual practices of the purged leaders. The leaders' speeches and official communiques highlighted the need to cleanse the movement of elements that threatened its moral integrity. Karl Ernst was named as one of the symbols of that supposed deviation. His execution was not presented as an individual punishment, but as part of a collective restoration of order. The narrative established a direct connection between personal conduct, political corruption, and institutional danger. That version was imposed in the media, in official documents, and in the versions taught to the new generations of the party. The logic of power changed, and with it the rules of survival. Those who had prospered through personal ties now found themselves unprotected. Karl Ernst, who had built his career between the street and offices, became trapped between the two spheres. His public figure was demolished with the same instruments that had previously sustained him: rumors, loyalties, images, and force. The return journey to Berlin takes place without civilian witnesses. The truck transporting Karl Ernst travels on monitored routes, with covered windows and no visible markings. The journey, which should have had an administrative purpose, becomes part of the staging. The objective is not to inform, but to eliminate with discretion. Once inside the capital, the vehicle heads towards a special detention center controlled by the SS. There, without trial, without interrogation, or the presence of judicial superiors, the execution order is carried out. Karl Ernst is murdered by men who obey a direct instruction from the party leadership. The body is not handed over to family members, nor is it published in official records. Ernst's elimination is handled with the same logic applied to other fallen figures during those days. The directive is to erase traces, reduce versions, and limit access to any type of documentation that allows for the reconstruction of the facts. In the following days, lists are modified, leaderships are reorganized, and all trace of his passage through the organization is eliminated. The men participating in Ernst's execution are part of a specially selected unit. Their task includes preserving secrecy. No names are allowed to be registered, nor are comments about the procedure to be exchanged. The operation is designed to remain outside of any subsequent review. Within the party's inner circle, the news is transmitted in a controlled manner. Some leaders receive a list with the names of those executed. Others only know the official version, drafted by the government's press office, which speaks of an alleged rebellion suppressed. A communiqué is published accusing the SA of immoral practices, disloyalty, and conspiracy against the order of the state. In that account, Karl Ernst becomes part of a subversive plot. Rumors spread quickly among those who had worked with him. Some deny having known him, others distance themselves from his memory to avoid suspicion. His circle disappears. Friends, allies, and subordinates reorganize their loyalties. No one asks about his whereabouts. Silence is imposed as a norm of survival. Within the SA, the new leaders assume command with a mixture of fear and obedience. In the following weeks, the corps in Berlin is restructured, new roles are assigned, and command is reorganized with personnel considered loyal to the new line drawn from above. In the streets of Berlin, where Ernst had been a visible figure, his name ceases to be mentioned. In the clubs where he used to appear, his absence becomes a warning sign. Some acquaintances who shared nightlife or informal meetings with him leave the city. Others are summoned for informational interviews. The purge also reaches certain circles who, although they did not hold official positions, had maintained social or personal ties with those executed. The control apparatus is activated to close any cracks. The days following the so-called Night of the Long Knives are marked by brief communiques and disciplinary measures. Local groups are dissolved, intermediate structures are merged, and massive reliefs are ordered. The SS, now with expanded power, assume functions that were previously in the hands of the SA. The message is clear. Order depends on absolute control from the top. In the following months, the official history of those days is written. Karl Ernst does not appear as a victim or a traitor. In some versions, his existence is not even mentioned. The official party historiography presents the events as a moral cleansing, necessary to preserve unity. In that account, the SS appear as saviors of order and guarantors of the national spirit. The SA, in contrast, are portrayed as an uncontrolled force. The figure of Röhm, also executed without trial, is turned into an example of the danger involved in granting power without oversight. In the collective memory of the city, Karl Ernst is reduced to a fragmented memory. Some former members of the SA preserve photographs, letters, or documents, but hide them. The fear of being associated with him continues. New directives prohibit paying homage to those who have been eliminated by direct decision of the leadership. The medals awarded, the speeches delivered in his honor, and the public acts in which he had participated are rewritten or eliminated. Some years later, when the new system of power has already consolidated, certain party historians attempt to justify the executions as part of a process of ideological purification. In these texts, Karl Ernst is briefly mentioned as an example of excesses that needed to be corrected. Conducts are attributed to him without documented proof. An image is constructed that combines ambition, disloyalty, and a dissolute private life. The objective of these publications is to prevent any form of martyrdom or vindication. In internal documents drafted by the SS, encrypted references to his execution are included. There are no explicit details, but the completion of certain operations in Berlin is mentioned. Reports on the state of the SA after the purge indicate that the elimination of figures like Ernst has been successful in reducing internal tensions. It is highlighted that the population has reacted calmly and that public functions continue without interruptions. This balance is presented to Hitler as evidence that the operation has met its objectives. Over time, Karl Ernst's name is relegated to dispersed archives. His passage through history is reconstructed by external researchers decades later, when documents begin to be released and oral testimonies begin to recover fragments of his story. His death becomes one of the first examples of absolute power exercised from the highest level. Following the arrests and executions in late June of 1934, the state apparatus organized legal and media coverage that presented the operation as a defense of the state. The leadership promoted a norm that retroactively enabled the use of force and created a framework protecting those who executed the orders. The wording appealed to public interest, the re-establishment of discipline, and the protection of the community. With this legal support, the purge ceased to be considered an internal adjustment and became incorporated into the reason of state. This decision facilitated the next stage, the administrative rewriting of the organizational chart and the replacement of leaderships linked to assault troops with officials aligned with the top leadership. In Berlin, the SA command was rapidly redistributed. Service records were updated, personal files were purged, and general lists were adjusted to the new hierarchy. Internal circulars instructed party offices and publishers to adapt publications, pamphlets, and almanacs. The administrative directive was simple: remove him from narratives, omit his signature in collective documents, and dispense with references that presented him as a reference point. Document management functioned as an instrument of institutional memory. The public narrative adopted an explicit moral component. Communiques formalized the idea of a moral cleansing within the movement and presented certain leaders as examples of unacceptable conduct. The discourse associated intimate practices with organizational disorder and security risks. Profiles disseminated by the government press described a picture of indiscipline attributed to personal networks with influence over appointments and favors. This narrative integrated the Berlin case into a broader context and used it to explain the magnitude of the operation. Homosexuality, tolerated in discreet circles in previous stages, became a label of discredit useful for ending careers and justifying dismissals. The reorganization of the SA advanced on two planes. On one hand, command was centralized, and a strict pattern of subordination to the party leadership and ministries with public order competencies was imposed. On the other hand, the mission was redefined. Physical training, basic drills, ceremonies, auxiliary tasks, and support for state campaigns. The newly appointed chief transmitted instructions for austerity, prudence, and observance of protocols. Metropolitan units reduced autonomous initiatives and became subject to prior authorizations for events and marches. In this transition, the profile of cadres like Karl Ernst proved incompatible with the adopted orientation. The propaganda system incorporated changes in audiovisual pieces and publications. Films, newsreels, and photo albums that had included images of parades with SA leaders received edits that cropped scenes, reordered sequences, or replaced narrations. Illustrated magazines published pedagogical texts on discipline, hierarchy, and cadre morality, with an emphasis on exemplary conduct and the idea of service. Analytical articles attributed clashes from previous months to excesses of local leaderships and presented the intervention of the top leadership as a prophylactic measure. Police management incorporated a stricter monitoring of personal relationships. Security offices expanded files and established risk categories associated with private habits. This expansion of controls extended to labor and military spheres. Forms for accessing jobs, courses, and promotions included questions of a moral nature and requests for endorsements. The episode of 1934 served as a precedent. Internal documentation cited it as an example of how certain connections could lead to disorders. This approach reinforced the idea of a preventive state that identifies behaviors, classifies, and directs directives towards personnel bodies. In the following years, anti-Semitic episodes of national scope exhibited the participation of brown shirts in street actions, with slogans, business surveillance, and visible presence during boycotts and disturbances. Formal instruction warned about limits, although the general framework favored intimidation and public shaming. This participation provided the image of a mobilized mass, while strategic decisions remained in the hands of other structures. On the external front, the organization maintained representation functions in annexed territories and in regions with German minorities, with indoctrination activities, sports competitions and ceremonies, always under centralized guidelines. In the internal reports circulated towards the end of the decade, the writers emphasized a shift from a street-fighting force to an auxiliary resource of the state. Member statistics remained high, which guaranteed availability for campaigns and mass events. However, the capacity for initiative decreased. This diagnosis appeared in memorandums comparing stages and positioning the intervention of 1934 as a turning point. In these documents, Karl Ernst's name remained absent. The outbreak of the war transformed tasks. Incorporation into military units was promoted, collections were encouraged, and preparation courses and complementary services were organized in cities and rural areas. Some formations associated with the SA tradition adopted historical denominations aimed at reinforcing morale. Internal bulletins recorded medals, marches, and farewell ceremonies. Official rhetoric aligned the past of mobilization with the wartime present and presented the organization as a source of discipline and vigor. In Berlin's case, all reference to its previous leadership was replaced by reviews of current structures and names in office. As the war years progressed, state propaganda consolidated versions that unified timelines and erased uncomfortable transitions. Materials for political education included chronologies that jumped from the struggle phase to the government phase, with an emphasis on continuity and cohesion. Manuals highlighted concepts of obedience, sacrifice, and service. In these narratives, the SA were integrated as a school of character whose value was measured by their devotion to the nation. The case of the purged leaders was reduced to generic allusions about indiscipline or conspiracies. Karl Ernst no longer appeared in texts, posters, or commemorative speeches. With the military defeat and the Allied occupation, captured documentation opened a field for judicial and academic work. In trials and denazification processes, numerous former SA members declared functions limited to parades, sports, collections, and guard shifts, shifting responsibilities to other organizations. Lawyers and experts presented reports differentiating between political command and auxiliary troops. The defensive narrative incorporated the idea of a temporary instrument for propaganda and public order. Within this framework, those purged in 1934 reappeared as examples of leaders who, according to these testimonies, had accumulated local power and caused clashes with central authority. Karl Ernst's name emerged in some pieces as a reference to a period without context development or source evaluation. In the historiographical sphere, several decades later, researchers with access to dispersed archives reconstructed trajectories and roles. Files, diaries, correspondence, and regional press were analyzed. Studies on political violence in the Weimar Republic, on the purge of 1934, and on the parastate functions of party organizations allowed for framing phenomena and actors. In this work, the figure of Karl Ernst regained dimension. A militant with urban organizational capacity, a regional chief close to the SA command, executed by direct decision during the operation in late June. This synthesis is supported by cross-referencing documents and helps to establish his role within the mechanics of ascent, control, and elimination. The plane of public memory presents another dynamic. Post-war monuments, plaques, and ceremonies prioritize civilian victims, political prisoners, the Jewish population, and opponents of various currents. The SA appear in narratives about radicalization, street intimidation, and participation in persecutions. In this context, Karl Ernst acquires a secondary presence and is studied primarily as a case within the movement's internal purge and as an example of how the regime used moral arguments to legitimize power decisions. Academic publications incorporate the information about his sexual orientation as an element of official justification, without making it an exclusive interpretative axis, and refer to the context of rivalries, strategy, and centralization. The teaching of these facts in textbooks and university courses highlights the chain reaction between organized violence, the political use of morality, and the administration of memory. Work is done on radio broadcasts, press clippings, manipulated photos, lists of executed individuals, and legitimizing decrees. With this approach, the end of Karl Ernst illustrates the conjunction of three vectors: the construction of street leadership, the perception of threat by the top leadership, and the legal propagandistic apparatus that transformed a collective elimination into an act of state. His trajectory, from regional leadership to his suppression, offers a map of how the regime recruited, promoted, and eliminated cadres with territorial impact. The subsequent administrative assessment confirms the operation's objective: reduction of the SA's autonomous margin, strengthening of structures preferred by the top leadership, and establishment of a moral criterion that acts as a filter for permanence. In this architecture, Karl Ernst's biography is incorporated as a closed file. The combination of ordinances, silences, and omissions ensures that his name remains outside canonical inventories. Subsequent research allows for reconstructing fragments, assigning chronologies, and specifying roles, while the documentation produced by the regime itself evidences the method, retroactive legal framework, moralizing narrative, and sustained suppression in archives and publications.